All right, it looks like we still have a couple of people joining us, but we're going to go ahead and get started so we can make the most of our time. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kristen Pope. I am a Natick resident, and I have the privilege of being an advisor to R.I.S.E Natick. In just a few moments, you are going to hear more about who and what R.I.S.E Natick is. We're excited tonight to have a vivacious conversation related specifically to anti-racism tenets. So we hope that you are engaged, and we're happy to have you here. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Bianca D'Antonio.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bianca D'Antonio. I graduated Natick High School in 2017, and now I'm a senior at Emerson College. So R.I.S.E Natick, the R.I.S.E is an acronym which stands for Racial Justice, Inclusivity, Social Justice, and Equity. And we are a youth-led coalition that recognizes racism and is committed to engaging in anti-racist work that combats systems of oppression. And we do so by partnering with organizations and community members through events such like this in Natick in order to grow an inclusive, equitable, and proactive community in which everyone can thrive. And now I will pop on over to Connor to introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Connor Shea. I am also a former NPS student, and I am currently a senior at Ithaca College. And I will pop it on over to Miriam.
Hi, everyone. I'm Miriam. I'm a current NPS student. I'm a junior at Natick High right now. So I'll pop it over to Dhruba.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dhruba Sen. I'm an anti-racist activist, and I practice the servant leadership model. And I'm also, like Kristen, I'm very honored and privileged to be an advisor to this group. Thank you, and I pop it back to Miriam, right?
Great. So just to remind everyone, our candidates are Gamal de Carvalho and Paul Joseph. So I'm gonna review the format of the panel. At the beginning, before we get into the questions, we're gonna give both of our candidates the opportunity to give a 2-minute long opening statement and introduce themselves to you further. At that point, we're going to go into a set of questions, and every candidate will get the same amount of questions. They'll get the same questions, and they will get equitable time to answer those questions. We will also be making sure that we're switching up the order of who's answering each question. And at the end of our questions, we will have 1-minute long closing statements. And we'll also have, if time permitted, we will have a portion of community Q&A. So if you have a question, you can feel free to message it to any of our hosts in the chat. And if we have time, we will get to that. So at this point, candidates, are you all ready to go? Great. So we will start off with Gamal. Yep.
She's muted. Do you need permission?
Thank you. So I won't mute myself again later. Lesson learned. So thank you. My name is Gamal de Carvalho, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all tonight. Just a little bit about myself, for those of you who aren't aware. I was a dreamer before there was a name for it. I came to this country when I was 5 years old with my family, and I've never imagined I'd be in a position like I am today to be running for a select board. The opportunities I've had are a result of the environment that I grew up in, the public schools that I went to, and the jobs that I've had, and the doors that were open for me. And becoming a US citizen, for me, that was the American dream. And I grew up in a town very much like Natick, and I've seen what's possible, and I've seen when you are engaged in local government and participating in decision making, that it creates an opportunity to improve lives and allow for other people to provide for their families and live their own version of the American dream. The select board's job is to make sure that the town works for everyone. And Natick is in such a critical moment as much of the country, and the select board sets the tone and the priorities for the town. I believe my experiences, perspective, and vision would be a welcome voice that would positively impact the direction of the town. My proven leadership and service on Finance Committee, as a co-founder of Natick is United and recently an appointed member of the Equity Task Force, as well as my professional experience as the Vice President of Human Resources and Chief Diversity Officer at Wayside Youth and Family Support Network, will help me move our town forward in a direction that is best for all our residents. And I want to show that a young woman of color like myself can serve on the select board and help Natick be the next anti-racist town by keeping our focus on how our local ordinances, policies, and procedures impact all of Natick's residents. These issues are not always easy, and oftentimes they can be in conflicting interests and priorities. But I believe that if we focus on people first, all people, we can continue to see Natick move
That
forward
is fine.
sustainably.
Thank you, Gamal.
Thank you, Gamal. So Paul, now you can give us a 2-minute opening statement.
Sure. My name is Paul Joseph. I'm obviously a candidate for the Natick Select Board. I've been a community volunteer in Natick for about 13 years. I got politically active back in 2007, 2008 with the threat of the closing of the Johnson Elementary School. Like many parents, we organized at that point and helped put an override on the budget to help stabilize our finances and keep the school open. Over the past 13 years, I've served previously, including as chair of the select board from 2010 to 2013. I was chair in the last year of that 3-year term. I've been a member and chair of the Economic Development Committee for 6 years and a town meeting member for 9 years. I moved back to Natick in 2002 after a brief stint here when my wife and I each went to graduate school. Both of my children, now young adults, 20 and 18, grew up going through Natick Public Schools. And in addition to being a longtime resident here, also bring 30 years of business experience. I've started or co-founded 3 businesses, 2 of which operate today in Natick. And I teach at the graduate level business principles and leadership. And I've also been served as a CEO of a nonprofit organization, the Metro West Chamber of Commerce, for several years. So, in terms of my priorities and why I'm running, this year the town will be hiring its next town administrator. And we're also coming out of a horrible pandemic that's going to have drastic impacts on our businesses in town. The businesses are important because their ability to pay taxes offsets our residents' ability to pay taxes. So with my business background and a lot of work in regional economic development, I find that the moment in 2021 is going to really demand somebody with deep knowledge, relationships, and the ability to connect quickly with this new town administrator to make sure they are successful in their role. Other than that, I look forward to this conversation. I think the issue of equity is a very important one. I believe the select board, to Gamel's point, sets the tone for things, and we must lead by example. So I appreciate this opportunity tonight.
Thank you, Paul. So we'll get started with our first question, which is going out to Gamal first. So Gamal, in 1 minute, can you explain what does a select board member do?
Well, the fastest way to explain it, like I do to my son, is that it's kind of like a 5-person mayor, but it's got a little bit of caveats because of the system of our government. So for those a little bit older than my 6-year-old son, the best way to talk about it is really that the select board oversees some key personnel in our town, like the town administrator and the chief of police. And by overseeing those positions, they can help set the tone for what those positions then are doing for their departments, right? So the select board doesn't necessarily oversee day-to-day functions of those kinds of departments, but they are responsible for overseeing the people who run those things. Select board also collaborates with and coordinates with the other committees, and there are a lot of committees in our town, and they are also responsible for putting warrants and things like that. When the warrants are basically, if you think of them like bills, like that would be in Congress, if there are certain things. Sure. Connor, would you mind if you could just maybe put your hand up a little bit before? That way I know, it'll give me a chance to wrap up the sentence.
Totally. Sounds good.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe a 15 or 10-second warning.
Yeah.
That'd be helpful, sure.
Yeah, I can do that for both.
But don't do it for me the first time.
Sure. Thanks, Gamal. So Paul, moving on to you. In 1 minute, explain what a select member does.
So the job description is in the town charter. Basically, the select board is the executive branch of the general government. We have other elected peers on the school committee that are responsible for the schools, and we have other elected bodies called the planning board responsible for zoning that also owns the master plan. The select board basically is a group of 5. We oversee and hire the town administrator, who is really the chief executive officer. Our charter refers to them as the chief administrative officer, but the fact is the 5 of us are volunteers in the community. We do not have day-to-day oversight of these employees, so we heavily depend on that town administrator to implement the strategy and the policies that we adopt on behalf of the community. So we're a public input and a public output in terms of how the rest of the government other than school committee functions. I was privileged to be part of the team that hired Chief Hicks when he came to town. We do hire the police chief, the fire chief, the comptroller, and several other positions like the Veteran Services Officer. While they don't technically report to us, they are accountable to us. So we do have to have a very close relationship with the town administrator to do the work.
From now on, I will be giving a hand when there are 10 seconds left at the end of questions.
Great.
Great, thanks, Paul. So Gamal, the second question is going to you first. So in 1 minute, how do you define anti-racism?
Define anti-racism as actively doing things to make sure that you are dismantling systems of oppression and working to create new systems and institutions to make sure that those new things don't reinforce or create oppression. So the anti-racism is actively doing things rather than just the absence of doing something.
Great, thanks. So Paul, we're going to give you the same question. In 1 minute, how do you define anti-racism?
So following an expert with a very concise definition, it's hard to expound on that other than I will say as a white male in a white supremacy, white privilege environment, I define anti-racism is the decisions that I and people like me make every single day to choose to be proactive about anti-racism. So while we passively do participate in systems that have clearly been racist over many years, I think we have a duty to make a choice every single day. As Jason Reynolds put forward in his book Stamped, I actually listened to an interview about it. He said it's a lot like being an alcoholic. You don't ever get away from alcoholism. We will never get away from racism, but every single day we wake up, we have to decide whether or not we're going to take a drink or not, whether or not we're going to engage proactively to make society better.
Thank you. So from here on out, all of the questions will have 2-minute long answers. And Connor will be giving a heads up when you have 15 seconds to go. Is that right?
We can do 15 or we can do 10, but 15, if 15 works for everyone, 15 works.
Great. Okay. So Gamal, this next question goes to you first. As a select board member, how would you work to ensure that there's an affordable, inclusive housing market in Natick?
Affordable housing takes a lot of different approaches, right? There isn't just one solution, and there's a lot of ways to think about it. And it's so important because of making sure that we are creating a town that is accessible for all kinds of different people, new people, as well as keeping people in place in Natick. And like I said earlier, through the select board, you set the tone for what those priorities are, and that conversation can help make it so that the other boards who do have responsibilities over the different systems and structures that would allow for more affordable housing, like the planning board that is interacting with our zoning laws and things like that. That's one avenue of doing that. So by making it a priority and making it a focus and creating the public conversation around it, it helps to make it clear that it's a priority for the other boards as well. And then the other aspect is to be flexible in understanding how our development is is incentivized in our town, and having a holistic approach and seeing how we can make it something that is not necessarily all in just one area of our town. We're going to be seeing a lot of changes in our town because of the pandemic, and there are going to be a lot of opportunities to think creatively about repurposing certain buildings in certain areas that may no longer be meeting the needs of things like office space and other things like that. And so just being open to those kinds of things and bringing up that kind of stuff in conversation will, allow some opportunity for that to develop. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Gamal. Paul will ask you the same question. As a select board member, how would you work to ensure that there is an affordable, inclusive housing market in Natick?
Sure. Well, I think Gamal touched on some of the key points. I think we do have to reimagine things, and it functionally as a select board, obviously the zoning board of appeals and the planning board focus on the zoning aspects of things, and any zoning changes have to go to town meeting, our legislative branch. So it's important that we continue to be setting this tone that yes, this is important, and it is, because we have a master plan called Natick 2030, which identifies it as such. I think you allow it to happen through a combination of communications with developers, putting incentives in place, as Gamal alluded to, but also having conversations to get ahead of this. I actually spoke with the general manager of the Natick Mall about a week and a half ago, just to get up to speed on what's been going on there. Retail is not coming back the way we know it. And I think there are tremendous opportunities to look at the Golden Triangle, which is the space of the Natick Mall and Shoppers World, as well as our Natick Center area, to find places and opportunities to develop this type of housing. But it's not just the housing that makes it accessible. We need to make sure that parking and or incentives to use a car or not use a car are in place. And if we're putting people into an area in terms of density to allow them access to transportation, we also have to make sure the sidewalks are safe and the ability to move around and get from point A to point B are also accessible. So housing is a comprehensive issue. We work with the safety committee and we work with other boards to find how to implement some of these ideas. The town administrator working with the head of DPW might work on the specific accessibility issues as well. So there are a lot of tactical things we can do in addition to the big picture, which is also fueled by an economic development vision that would be supported by a housing plan.
Great, thank you. We'll go back to Gamal for our next question. So according to the Town of Natick website, the select board appoints various department heads and members of boards and commissions. What does an equitable hiring process look like to you, and how would you implement that?
The biggest thing that you want to think about when you're talking about hiring, recruiting, retention, all of those things, and applying an equity focus to that process is to make sure that you are prioritizing the right things. Oftentimes, the urgency to fill a position gets in the way of really allowing a true diverse pool of candidates to apply. And so when you prioritize things like urgency, sometimes you end up losing out on equity. And one of the things that's really important about that process is also to make sure that it's clear that it's not just about the recruiting, it's about the retention, and making sure that when people are, working for our town, that they feel like they're in an inclusive environment. They feel they can be all of who they are at work. They can bring in new ideas that might not be unfamiliar to the people in town and take leadership in that process. And so it's important to, when you create that kind of system, that in of itself radiates out to the world and brings candidates who wouldn't necessarily feel like they should apply because they're not going to necessarily be welcome in our town, right? Or feel like they can be all who they are at work. And this is something that we've run into a little bit maybe with our difficulty of hiring and retaining teachers of color in the school. And that one of the things that we've heard there is that you might be able to be interested in the job, but we can't afford to live there, right? So then that's not creating that inclusivity that we want in order to then be able to retain. And so similarly with any appointed position, it's about making sure that we can get out into different pools of possible candidates and make people aware of those kinds of positions and then also feel like they will be welcome in town.
Thank you, Gamal.
Thank you. So, Paul, according to the Town of Natick website, the Select Board appoints various department heads and members of boards and commissions. What does an equitable hiring process look like to you, and how would you implement that?
So I think there are a couple of factors here. Number one, we do have the equity task force that's now underway to give some guidance to the select board. I think they will have some valuable inputs in terms of assessing what we're doing today and what we need to be doing to achieve a more equitable process. So I think starting with listening, we've empowered a body to go out and study this issue. So I'd want to understand what they have to say and make sure we're addressing that. I hate to come back to it constantly, but I probably will tonight. The hiring of the town administrator is the single most important decision the select board will make this year. That individual is going to set the tone for the culture under which all of these departments function. So for me, having a strong town administrator that actually has in their goals equity as a hiring and development objective, I think is another place where the select board can get involved, because we oversee that individual and then it's delegated through them. And then in addition to, the affordability question, I think part of it is we have to think broadly about these things. We have the ability to influence tax policy. Maybe there are incentives for homes, or we can look at tax relief or some other types of programs that could give, tiered approach to town employees, maybe credits for employees that are tenured in town for a certain period. I think there are opportunities to get creative, but it does start with what an enterprise would do, which is a lot of what Gamel's already covered. You have to basically have a welcoming place. And you also have to extend your invitation beyond what we traditionally have done. Massachusetts municipal employees tend to be found from Massachusetts municipal sites. We have to go national. We need to make sure we're broadening our outreach and giving an honest opportunity for out-of-state candidates to come in and help us truly become a more diverse community. And one of the perks of this pandemic is we can do that now online more effectively and at lower cost.
Great, thanks, Paul. So we'll go back to Gamel for our next question. How will you seek out the voices of color in Natick that are not already at the table?
So this is one of the things that I think is one of the more primary responsibilities of the select board after the direct duties of the select board, but is doing that outreach. I think it's really hard to get involved in Natick government without knowing someone who's already involved in Natick government, right? And this is one of the things that it's not always clear who to go talk to, what kind of things they can and can't do, and one of the things that's I feel like would be most important in my role as a select board member is being a communicator out to other communities and going to them, right? Instead of waiting for them to come into the process themselves, because you're not going to be able to, they're not going to feel like they can, because no one has come to talk to them first, right? And if that means going to different organizations that are in the community, different groups, or if that means going directly door to door when, you know what I mean, that's something that's more feasible for people. Or if that means using social media or the traditional media to get out information in a variety of different ways and in a variety of different languages and in a variety of different vocabulary, so that it doesn't feel like it's all inside baseball. You know what I mean? And using all of those different methods to just communicate the message that we want them to be involved. We want to hear their voices.
Thanks, Gamal. So Paul, we'll ask you the same question. How will you seek out the voices of color in Natick that are not already at the table?
I think the challenge we have, and this is a rhetorical question, the select board is an uncompensated group of volunteers that handles an extraordinary amount of work on behalf of the community. What's been interesting to me about this campaign in particular, compared to when I ran in 2010, was the role of social media and really the one-click expectations of our community to be there for every issue in an immediate response. One of the failures of Natick over the last years since I've been involved has been a communication strategy. We have so many fragmented implemented online presence groups right now, but we don't have concert to that. And sometimes people in the community hear things and they think it's an official response because it's coming from an elected or appointed official, but it's not. So I think one of the things we can do as a select board is really focus our communication strategy, maybe hire a chief communications officer that can bridge these gaps. Then we can allow in a scalable way the outreach to groups like Natick is United and Black Lives Matter Natick, and actually have a truly integrated online presence that's accessible to everyone. Door to door for specific issues, if that's warranted based on potentially, as we've seen, some hate issues that pop up, I do think it's important for the select board to be present. And you will find when we're out of this pandemic, I think elected officials tend to be out in the community. I've missed that the most part, but I also think it's a two-way street. Democracy is a conversation. It's not a broadcast. And so our goal is to really make it a welcoming one so people do know where they can go. People should be able to go to the Town of Natick website and within 1 or 2 clicks figure out who they need to speak with or find a group that's willing to have these conversations with them.
Thank you, Paul. So we're going to switch order now. So Paul, this question will go out to you first. So the minority community in Natick is just that, a minority. How do you feel anti-racism should be prioritized for what is seemingly such a small group of people?
I think every one of our 36,000 community members needs to own a piece of this solution. I think we've done it in some demonstrable ways with some of the movements we've had with the peace flags, some of which really were the byproduct of some terrible incidents, either at the national or local level. But I do think it's important for us as a community to continue being very public and being very welcoming about these types of initiatives to reach out. In terms of anti-racism in particular, again, as a select board member, we can affect the policies and the priorities of the town. So if we choose in terms of looking at a diversification strategy for populating boards or even selecting members of the board, I think that's where it starts. To be honest with you, we've got a committee right now selecting the town administrator, and we've got an equity task force. The equity task force itself has 2 white people from the select board on it, and it has the superintendent of schools representing. Those are 3 powerful positions that, in my opinion, shouldn't be part of the screening or the recommendation piece, but should be the beneficiaries of the work. While it's important for them to be involved in terms of forming the committee, that's a good example of sometimes we form task forces, but I think the mix and the intent needs to be understood. Even the screening committee for the town administrator itself, this select board will be hiring that person, but there's a screening process going on right now. And I question and look at the composition of that as an example of another place where, in terms of bringing equity into the process, at least when they're doing their community interviews, which I understand they've done something on the order of 50 or so, making sure that we're reaching out to people of color and people that will have important inputs to inform the priorities that the select board will impose on the next town administrator.
Thank you, Paul. So now we'll go over to Gamel. The minority community in Natick is just that, a minority. How do you feel anti-racism should be prioritized for what is seemingly such a small group of people?
Equity benefits everyone. It's not a minority issue. It's not a niche issue. And although it may seem like you're addressing the needs of maybe a small portion of the community, it's actually something that helps everyone, right? They're the famous illustrations that explain what the concept of equity is, and it's usually 3 people standing in front of a fence, and you give if you give everyone the same, they're different heights, you give everyone the same, they're not going to. Some of them will just be taller over the fence they already could see, and others still won't be able to see. But the true way of thinking about equity is to remove the fence completely and remove the barrier. Why does the fence need to be there at all? Is there a purpose that fence is serving other than keeping people out, right? And so when you think of an equity focus for the town and anti-racism focus for the town, it lifts all boats and it removes barriers for people, that it removes it for everyone. So it's something that benefits us all. And that's something that I see every day at work. We've committed at my job of moving towards being an anti-racist organization. And what that's done is it's reduced our turnover of our staff of color. It's doubled our managers of color, but it's also created an environment that our white staff feel more committed, more engaged in their work. They're more productive because of it. They stay longer in their jobs. And so it might on its face seem like we did certain things and we changed certain policies, and thinking about maybe a smaller portion of the population, but that change impacts everybody, and that change makes it better for everyone as a whole.
Thanks, Gamal. So we'll go back to Paul now. Paul, how will you measure the success of effective anti-racist initiatives?
That's a tough one. I think it's an ongoing conversation. As I said before, I think the notion of having some metrics in place, at least in terms of making sure that we are establishing HR policies that are, in my opinion, anti-racist. I don't know what the professional requirements are in terms of sort of development and putting an sort of equity or anti-racism hiring process in place. But when we do, I think it's important to make sure that we are holding the people that oversee that process accountable. Obviously, stepping back and thinking of the community at large, I think part of it is just making sure that we are getting a constant, inflow and dialogue going with people of color, with minority populations in the community. And we will see that based on their engagement in these committees and making sure that their voices are heard. I think one of the things that I've been impressed by over the last year in particular are the many sources of dialogue that we have going on. I think what's very hard about it, though, is sometimes we don't know to what end. It feels good that we're surfacing these issues, but sometimes, when we look for concrete results, it's harder to find those. So I would look to specific policies and longer term goals and make sure that we're making progress on those in terms of whether it's a diversification of board members, diversification of staff, or diversification of businesses and engagement with the community. And I think you can put incentives in place to do that and make sure that as we look at the mix of retailers, for example, attracting minority-owned businesses and underrepresented population members as entrepreneurs, that's something we can tangibly see and solicit and engage in. So I look to examples like that as the seeds that then will grow into something that truly becomes a more diverse and anti-racist community.
Great. So going back to Gamal, how will you measure the success of effective anti-racist initiatives?
It's by measuring them. It's by measuring the outcomes and the impact of them. And it's also by being willing and open to understanding that although a policy or a procedure may be in place with a certain intent or may be changed with a certain intent, that it can have an unforeseen impact. And being willing to then shift and redirect at that point and think of a new plan. For me, if you were to name what the outcomes would be of an anti-racist Natick, and it would be having more people engaged in the process. There would be more diversification and accessibility for housing. There would be a more of a mix of people by all sorts of categories in a town meeting and committee partnership, by age, by gender, by race, by economic status, and ability, and all sorts of different things. And that equity becomes part of a conversation of all aspects of our town and all policies that are being talked about and being made, and that all people in town, in the town government and in the town as a whole, are taking ownership over that process. So all of those things are concrete, tangible outcomes of effective equity policy.
Thanks, Gamal. So we'll move over to Paul now. So Paul, what is the first action that you would take towards anti-racism in Natick?
The first action. Yeah, this sounds like I don't know, maybe I'm dodging the question. The first action is the one I'm taking every day with myself, making sure I'm in check and being intellectually honest about the work I'm doing. I think I bring that to the decision-making process in terms of leverage and where we take that. Again, I think it comes down to the fact that, as 20% of the select board, the board itself needs to make sure that we are, again, bringing in an individual and empowering them to hire and delegate and develop the talent that's going to actually implement the community's programs. So, again, we lead by example. We set that tone, to use Gamel's words. I think it's important that the select board does that. And in terms of an anti-racist policy or action, I live those actions. Every individual has to live those actions. I'm not saying that we can't do more as a community, but it starts with the individuals, and you put it together to become a solution. So I would personally start with letting the equity task force do its charged job and listen very actively to what they have to say and make sure that we are honoring the mission of that group. I suspect we're going to move in the direction of hiring a chief diversity officer, at least a community engagement or a community participation officer, and really systematically absorb their recommendations into a structure at town hall that will open those doors to equity and open those doors or reduce those barriers or take the fence away, to use Gamel's earlier analogy.
Thanks, Paul. So back over to Gamel. What is the first action that you would take towards anti-racism in Natick?
Hiring a town administrator that understands that equity is part of their job. And making sure that they know that it's not just a side project thing that is nice to have, but it is integral to everything that they do and will be something that they'll need to create clear plan and directive for. I already always talk about equity. So it'd be a little unfair for me to say that that would be the first thing to do, because that's one of the things that I've really appreciated about this campaign is the ability to bring this conversation to Natick and to this campaign and make it be something that we're all engaging in that process. And short of the hire of the town administrator directly, this would be the next thing, is bringing this conversation and this focus and this perspective to all the various decision making that comes before the select board.
Thank you, Gamal. So at this time, we're going to ask a couple questions that come from the community, but we're going to do it in the same format as before. So you will both have 2 minutes to answer these questions. So we'll continue going with Paul first. So Paul, how do you define diversity, equity, and inclusivity?
Diversity, equity, and inclusivity. Well, again, if we're drawing on the image that I think a lot of us have seen in terms of the boxes, I think you can talk about diversity as the mix of individuals that are there. Do we have a diverse and representative group? Inclusivity is basically involving people in the process. So making sure that there's an opportunity and it's accessible to people to engage in the process, participate, lead the process. And equity is, again, giving those individuals of varying needs what they need to succeed in that environment. So equity is about not only taking the barriers away, but actually a force, a positive force, bringing them into the process as needed.
Thank you. So we'll ask that to Gamal. Gamal, how do you define diversity, equity, and inclusivity?
Diversity is about making sure that we have a representative group of people in the room. Inclusivity is making sure that they feel comfortable that they're there, and equity is that they're participating in the process of building the room in the first place. And when you look at a town or an organization, you can apply aspects of that lens to an organizational change process as well, right? And so for our town, it's our people town meeting really representative of all of us, or is it representative of the people who feel like they have access to and have the time to be able to participate in that process, right? So if we're bringing in the right representative mix of people into that room, that in of itself is going to create an ability to have a better conversation. But that conversation won't go very far if people don't feel comfortable speaking their experiences and bringing those different perspectives to the table. And so we have to make sure that people feel comfortably all of who they are in our town, in our government, in all aspects. And equity is about looking not just at making people feel comfortable, but actually looking at institutions and processes, forms, procedures, the charter, structures of things, and changing those systems so that they are removing those barriers to begin with. That process in of itself is something that takes a long time and is always ongoing, and you need to constantly be tending to.
Great. So we'll go back to Paul for our next question. How will you make it easier for underrepresented business owners to bring their businesses into Natick and then have long-term success?
So I think it's a combination of things. One of the things a lot of times people say, why don't we just get this company, or why don't we just get this type of business? And you have to appreciate the private sector aspect of that. There's a tremendous amount of activity going on with Natick Center Cultural District and the proactivity of our merchants to really diversify our merchant base in downtown Natick. We're lucky we have Dates and Olives, which is a minority-owned business. We have many women-owned businesses. We have LGBTQ business owners. And in terms of Black representation, we don't have a high Black representation. I think there's a business in the mall that expanded from Framingham called Nzuko, that's a food purveyor. I think we can do more. We have a great opportunity with South Main Street. There's going to be lower cost, more affordable micro retail sites, pop-up retail. I've been talking to people about the idea that if we're serious as a community about extending this welcome, we could leverage the public-private partnership of a Natick Center Cultural District and provide incentives in the form of maybe reduced rent or other incentives to bring in minority-owned businesses. I also believe at some point in time, I would love to explore the idea of a REIT, real estate investment trust, that actually might buy property and be controlled by the investors. Those could be community members. And the community members taking ownership of property is a major step that we can take in economic development to control our destiny as a community. I've tried in the past to talk to building owners about this. Our buildings downtown are only owned by a handful of organizations. So it's very hard sometimes to say we want this to go in there, because it's really up to a small number of controlling factors. So in terms of incentivizing them to provide either reduced rents or other types of outbound activities, such as we've been doing, I think we have to kind of do it in a balanced way with our merchants, at least at downtown.
Thank you, Paul. So Gamel, how will you make it easier for underrepresented business owners to bring their businesses into Natick and have long-term success?
This is one of the things about the systems that are currently in place and the ways in which we need to think about them. There are often times where there are barriers in place that people don't realize are barriers, right? And making sure that our regulations are clear and streamlined and understandable, and that all of those, that there's a system in place that helps shepherd a person through the process of understanding what those things are. Those are the kinds of things that you need to put in place in order to be able to really create an environment in which people who aren't going to have necessarily the same amount of not only social capital, but like literal financial capital sometimes, to be able to withstand the long process sometimes that it takes to start a business and sustain a business and access certain developments in town. It takes having a tremendous amount of all of that knowledge in place before even starting the process, right? And so how can we make those kinds of things more transparent to people and navigate the people through that process?
Great, thank you. So now we have some questions coming in from the chat. So I'm going to turn it over to Connor to ask those.
All right, just give me 1 second to figure out the order. Okay, first question, I think we are even in terms of who's gone first at this point. Let's just keep it with Paul. Paul, this question is asking, how do we hold town officials accountable when they are involved in acts of hate?
How do we hold them accountable? They're public figures. I think we hold them accountable first and foremost with our votes. You know, we disempower people that are not representative of our community. Obviously, if they're involved in acts of hate and they cross a criminal line, we have them investigated and we follow legal channels. I think, you know, we saw some of this flare up after the events of January 6th. And I think a lot of people wanted to, you know, have the select board address these issues in manners that they are just not legally empowered to do. So I think there's a combination of things, but I also think it's very important. You know, we're in a very tenuous time right now. Social media has been weaponized for different political reasons. And I think how we go after people sometimes is not what I consider due process. And yes, in a white supremacy, white sort of dominant white privilege justice system right now, you know, that's, you know, an example of some place where, you know, by having, you know, I guess inappropriate responses or you know, unjustifiable responses, you have to be very careful as a community. You do open yourself up to legal challenges. You do open yourself up to other unforeseen consequences. So I think we as a community, we hold people accountable by showing up to public meetings, having conversations during open mic times, not voting them into office, and actively working against their reelection. And again, if it's crossed a line into a tenuous legal space, we pursue that. You know, we will bring up charges where necessary. But I think one thing we've seen in this community is we also are truly blessed to have a lot of active individuals and groups. And as a community sort of spokesperson, the select board members can also play a role in healing and understanding and bringing community dialogue to these issues.
Thank you, Paul. Gamel, same question for you. How do we hold town officials accountable when they are involved in acts of hate?
You know, it's it was very disheartening and upsetting to learn about you know, town residents and town officials participating in things like the insurrection. And I know that that's something that really is not something that we want Natick to be known for, right? And that's an extreme example of a situation. And there are also a lot of situations where it may be a town official or it might just be residents, right, who are impacting other people in ways that maybe they're not intending, and yet has the impact of perpetuating hate or bias. And one of the things that we want to make sure to do it as a community is to make clear what our values are, right? In the absence of making clear what our values are, people who participate in hate get the opportunity to define that for us. And that's not something that we want to do. So for me, you know, it's unfortunate that there aren't necessarily very specific mechanisms to hold accountable other than through the vote, which is very important and is something that we absolutely need to do and make clear to our town officials if they are engaging in something like that, that they're no longer going to have that support and no longer be able to be voted in. But we have to go beyond that and be able to be clear about what our values are and say those things. That's one of the reasons why Natick is United was formed in 2016, was to make clear what our values in our town really truly are. And that's something that is something that the select board does have the power to do.
Thank you so much. So I think now that we're at 7:50, we should head on into closing statements, Miriam. Miriam, I'll hand it back over to you for that, just so we have enough time to wrap up at the end as well.
Great. So since Gamal gave her opening statement first, we'll have Paul give his closing statement first. So as a reminder, closing statements are 1 minute. So Paul, you can go ahead whenever you're ready.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank R.I.S.E. Natick for inviting us here tonight. It's a great continuing conversation that this community's been having. I look forward to the opportunity to serve the town again, hopefully in the near term. I also think it's very important to understand, we need to identify what the roles are for the select board and be aware of the limitations of what they can do and the opportunities that we have. It's important that as you look at everything through an equity lens, that you're also not biasing your evaluation, because affordability does impact everyone in the community. I think time is a precious commodity, the ability to contribute to town meeting. I actually had to step down from the select board the last time because I was self-employed with a wife going to school full time and 2 young preteen kids. So time is a precious commodity. We need to look at these very important issues from a holistic lens. And while the equity lens is an important one, the implementation and how we work that through takes command of the systems that we have to work in and how we might change them together.
Thank you, Paul.
Great, Gamal. You can start your closing statement whenever you're ready.
Sure. So I really appreciate it, and I'm so excited that we have the chance to have this conversation today. And I look forward to the amazing work that this organization is going to continue to be doing, and bringing this conversation to our town. An equity focus for Natick is ensuring that a critical eye is looking at our ordinances, our policies and procedures, and how it's impacting everyone. It's in making sure that elected and appointed officials are hearing from a diverse range of stakeholders, and that those stakeholders feel welcome and respected. And it is the commitment to advocate for these voices and to pursue important changes when necessary. An equity focus is something that helps everybody. And so therefore, it's something that we want to look to apply to all the different strategic decision making for our town.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, well, that brings us to the end of the panel. I just want to take a moment to say a few thank yous. First, to our candidates, Gamel and Paul, thank you for taking the time out of your schedule and joining us, answering our questions, which keep in mind for everyone who's watching, they did not have these questions prior to tonight. So we appreciate you taking the time to come out and do this. I want to say thank you to our advisors, to Ruba and Kristen, putting this on. This is our first event as an organization, so that is very exciting. And then I want to thank everyone who came out and listened. I think this is a really important thing, and to have a community that is engaged and takes the time to listen to what these candidates have to say is just incredibly valuable. So I want to thank each and every one of you for coming out tonight. So everyone remembers this is recorded, and we'll talk about how we can get this out. So if you have a friend, a neighbor who would like to take a look at this later, we'll figure out ways to get that out to you. But in the meantime, I hope all of you are doing well, staying safe, and I hope you have a great evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.